exciting to watch. Man works out how to use the internet. Okay, I think I am now live on Facebook, and I think I'm now live on Instagram. Marvelous. So I will start again. Hello, my name is Chris. I am the artistic director of the Rose Theatre in Kingston. I am also I used to be the artistic director of the not the King's Head, of the Gate Theatre in Notting Hill. And Fiona, who is the exec director at the King's Head and is an amazing person, is a friend of mine, and she asked me to come on to the internet, this scary place. And King's Head's told me I'm live. It's brilliant. Everything's working. It's amazing. I'm astonished and useless at the internet usually. All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then if you want to ask questions, you can, and I will try and answer as I figure out how all this works. So I have been directing since 2005. I actually trained as an actor at the Central School of Speech and Drama after I was at university. And then when I was at drama school, I think the key lesson I learned while I was training as an actor was that I didn't want to be an actor. There were just people in my year who were better at it. And I found in classwork that I was much more interested in working with my peers and getting performances out of them than I was in performing myself. There was something about the kind of dynamic that I had with other students that I found really exciting. So I decided as I was at drama school that maybe that wasn't the thing that I wanted to do, and that directing might be interesting, because actually what I really loved was the rehearsal process. So I made the decision whilst I was there that I was going to try and pursue directing, and I was very, very lucky that in my final week at drama school, a friend of mine who was already a director had helped me kind of put my acting CV together to sort of look like a director's CV, like I directed one thing at university and a couple of small things at Central. So we kind of made that look like a director's CV. And she was then asked by the Traverse Theatre in Edinburgh, who were looking for an assistant director, if she could recommend anyone. And she sent them my CV, and I got the job, which was really exciting. And I assisted Philip Wilson on a show called The Found Man at the Traverse in 2005 for their Edinburgh Festival season. And that's sort of how it began. And then my career since then has sort of been defined by various things. So in terms of the organisations I've worked with, I spent several years working with a company called On Theatre, run by Mick Gordon, who's a theatre director and a writer. And Mick was really interested in doing shows on given subjects. And I'd seen his show at the Soho Theatre called On Ego that was about how the brain worked, which I found just really, really thrilling. And I saw he wrote an article in The Guardian saying the next thing he was going to do was about religion. And I did my degree in theology. I'm not religious, but I'm very interested in religion as a subject matter. And so I wrote to him, and we had coffee and got on, and I ended up working with him on that show. And we spent a year and a half researching it and interviewed all sorts of people, from Richard Dawkins, who I loathe, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who at the time was Rowan Williams. And we actually published those interviews in a book. But those interviews then formed the basis of a fictional play called On Religion. So that was one strand. Another strand, and another really, really formative experience I had, was working at the Bush Theatre. And I was an associate director there from 2008 to 2011, working specifically on a project called 66 Books, which was a project where I met Josie Rourke, who was then running the Bush, at an event at the RSC in 2008. So the RSC had organised this big symposium, and around the publication of the King James Bible, which was going to happen in 2011. So 3 years ahead, they were saying, what can we do as an industry to mark the kind of publication of this foundational text of the English language? And on the train back from that event, I happened to be sitting next to Josie. I'd never really met her before. And she said to me, wouldn't it be amazing if we could commission 66 writers to respond to each of the 66 books of the King James Bible? And that really, really excited me. And you can see my interest in theology coming in here again. And so I sort of said, yes, I'd be really up for that. And we then spent the next 3 years making that project happen. And it was one of the most, at different times, exhilarating, terrifying, uplifting, stressful things I've ever done. But at the end of it, we had this incredible collection of short plays written by everyone from Carol Ann Duffy to Wallace Ienka to Billy Bragg. We had 120 actors performing them across different nights over 3 weeks to open the new Bush Theatre in the library. We did an overnight event in Westminster Abbey. And actually, it was that experience that gave me a real belief that actually what I wanted to do was run my own building. because I love directing, I love being in a rehearsal room, I love working with actors. But actually, what I found so thrilling about that project was looking at the whole thing on a much bigger scale. You know, I enjoyed the commissioning process. I enjoyed the fundraising. I really enjoy fundraising. I'm quite unusual for that, I think. But I enjoyed all of these different elements and the whole notion of bringing it together, and directing some of those plays was just one cog in a much bigger machine. And I learned a huge amount from Josie. And actually, I've been very lucky throughout my career to have been able to have some extraordinary relationships with people who've been real mentors to me. You know, Philip Wilson at Salisbury, Mick Gordon with On Theatre, Josie Rourke at the Bush, and then and others since then. So it was 66 books that really made me realize that I wanted to look at the whole structure of how a project worked. And I was then very lucky that as that project was coming to its climax in 2011, the Gate Theatre announced that they were looking for a new artistic director. My brilliant predecessors there, Natalie and Carrie, had said they were leaving. So I applied for that job. And on the day of my first interview, happened to be the day that the 66 Books project was announced. And there was a big double-page spread in the Evening Standard and photos of the writers we were working with and stuff. And so when I was asked in the interview, what have you been working on recently? I could say, well, you can read about it in the Evening Standard, which is a really, really good answer for an interview question. And so I got the Gate. And I think in terms of turning this sort of conversation into being more about just like me and my career, I'm really interested in what an artistic director does. Like, how do you define that job? I actually spent a couple of years working on a book called The Art of the Artistic Director, where I interviewed 20 different artistic directors about how they ran their buildings. And when I got when I applied for the Gate job, I had a conversation with Josie and said I was going to apply. And she said to me, you know, there's something about that theatre having a reputation for doing international work. And there's something about us living in an increasingly globalized world. Maybe you could find a way into the identity of that building in that way. And that really struck me because I tend to think quite politically and I'm interested in how the world works. So I went into my interview at the Gate and I said, the Gate is a theatre that does international work. Under Natalie and Carrie, they did a lot of European playwriting. They did a lot of work with dance theatre, some really exciting stuff, very different from the kind of stuff that I'm naturally drawn to. But so I said in my interview, look, if I get the job, I will make the Gate a place that examines how the world works. We will look at the structures and the systems and the processes that shape the planet, and we will explore those on our stage. And that's what we ended up doing. We produced work about the Arab Spring. That was in my first year. We produced a play called Grounded, which is about drone warfare. We produced an adaptation of Trojan Women that looked at the kind of the way that women are often marginalized and abused in warfare. So that kind of became the through line of the work I was doing there, and everything that we did at the Gate, in one way or another, I could say it's about examining how the world works. I then went freelance. I left the Gate after 5 years, had an amazing time, but I always said of the Gate that it's a theatre that's best run by somebody who doesn't quite know what they're doing. There's something from the energy of going, I don't know, sort of making it all up as you go along that's really important for that tiny space. And 5 years in, I felt like I'd sort of got on top of it, and I knew what would work and what wouldn't. So I decided to leave and I went freelance, and the brilliant Ellen McDougall took over from me at the Gate and immediately demonstrated there were a whole load of things you could do in that theatre that I hadn't done, which was kind of brilliant and humbling at the same time. And I spent 3 years being freelance. And if I'm honest, I made some really exciting work in that time, worked with brilliant theatres like the Old Vic and in Bristol and the Exchange in Manchester and the Royal and Derngate in Northampton. But what was missing from that was a sense of being able to think more broadly than just about my own work. Being a freelancer, I found, could be a bit narcissistic because you're constantly approaching theatres and artistic directors and trying to pitch yourself and trying to make your own ideas seem exciting to them. But actually, there were often times when I would read a play that I would go, well, this is a brilliant play. I'd love to see it on, but I'm not the person to direct it. And also, I really enjoyed kind of working with young artists and mentoring them. And that's something that's harder to do when you don't have the infrastructure of a building around you. And so the Rose came about because, sort of out of the blue, actually, I wasn't aware the job was available. It was November last year, and I'd made a short film that was showing at the London Film Festival. So I remember getting an email from my agent when I was in a cinema saying, you've been asked if you want to apply for this job. And so I spoke to Robert O'Dowd, who's the CEO at the Rose and a really brilliant guy, and we got on really well. And he said to me, look, the Rose has 822 seats. So for me, it was automatically interesting because it's so different from the Gate. You know, it's more than 10 times the size. And he said, we've got so many seats, so we need to do shows that have real popular appeal, that people really want to see. You know, he said that means we basically need big titles, big actors, or it needs to be a big event. You know, and what a big event is sort of been defined in different ways. But, you know, Trevor Nunn directed The War of the Roses there, you know, these 3 long plays. So that was a kind of an event in itself. And so I went for my interview and I said to them, all right, look, I take that, you know, I get that those are the things you need to do, but those are fundamentally financial imperatives. An artistic policy needs to kind of look about why you're doing those things. And so I said that what I would do if I took over the Rose is I would take those familiar plays, those familiar stories, those familiar actors, and try and present them in a way that felt completely fresh, completely new, and completely exciting. So making the familiar feel box fresh was the phrase that I used. Now, I've only just started at the Rose, and obviously, you know, suddenly global events have kind of rather got in the way of planning my first season, but I'm keeping my eye on the horizon and pressing on. But what I want to do is exactly find what are those novels, what are those famous plays, who are those actors that we love, and how can we make them feel new? How can we make them feel fresh? An example of this, not from my programming, is Nick Heitner directed A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Bridge Theatre last year, and he swapped Oberon and Titania around, so it was Titania casting a spell on Oberon, and the show had a disco in the interval, and it was this kind of brilliant pansexual, queer, incredible show. And that was really thrilling to me. You know, that felt like it had taken that play, made it that was really familiar, but then made it feel completely fresh and completely new. And so I used that in my interview as an example of the kind of show that I would want to do at the Rose. And I'll stop in a minute and answer questions, but I suppose what I'm trying to say is that although the Gate and the Rose are very different, and what I want to do in those buildings are very different, what I'm trying to do as an artistic director is find a consistency through the programming, and then ensure that also, you know, there's a clear vision. So at the Gate, it was about examining the way the world works. At the Rose, it's about making the familiar feel fresh. And then looking also at how that embodies itself in the programming on the stage, but how it also then embodies itself at every element across the building, from our marketing to our front of house to our community work and everything, so that there feels like there's a really cohesive, vibrant energy that kind of percolates through the building. And I think if you look at some of the really successful artistic directors, you can see that in their work. You know, David Lann at the Young Vic, what he did was incredibly eclectic, but his constant thing was find the director, surprise them with a play that they might not have thought about directing, put those two together and see what happens. And then you get Ivo Van Hove's A View from a Bridge. I remember Rupert Gould, when he ran Headlong, I had a meeting with him and he said to me, we want to do work, you know, we're not interested in doing stuff that we just think might be good or might be interesting. We want to do stuff that's really great. And at the time I kind of thought, well, that's quite a sort of nebulous thing to say. But actually, if you look at the work that he produced at Headlong and you look at the work that he produces at the Almeida, it is really, like, there is a kind of greatness to it. And I don't know, that's quite a vague thing to say, but there's a level of ambition that is really, really eye-catching. And, you know, Nick Heitner, I'll just use one more example and then I'll have a look at the questions. Nick Heitner, I once saw him give a talk when he was running the National, and he said, you know, what we want to do is, he says, the work you make has to be popular. It has to be artistically rigorous, but it has to be popular. And he was kind of absolutely shameless and absolutely rightly so about going, we want to make work that people desperately want to see. And again, you see that whether it's One Servant, Two Governors or Warhorse or The History Boys, you know, he made work that had real rigor, but that really, really was about drawing in a broad audience. So I think with a really good artistic director, you can, even though the work might feel quite eclectic on the surface, you can often see a real coherence underneath it, that there's a real sort of thought pattern that kind of manifests itself. And that's not something necessarily that an artistic director might even be conscious of. I think some are more sort of self-conscious about it than others, but really great work, you know, the trick is to make work, to program a season that has eclecticism, that has variety, that reaches out to different communities and different groups, but that has a kind of constant and consistent identity. I'm going to see if there are any questions. let's see, what does this say? Jordan Freud. I think I'd really enjoy fundraising as well as directing work. This is why I want to work as an associate artistic director one day. Completing my university dissertation while working on individual projects with the company. This is really helpful to hear. Yeah, fundraising is really, really important. I think some artistic directors see it as a burden and as something that they kind of have to do, but it is it's a vital part of the work, because if you don't have money, then you can't be ambitious, or you can't be ambitious, or certainly I can't be ambitious in the way I want to be. If you have money and you spend it well, you are able to make more ambitious work. You are able to pay your artists more, which is really, really essential. At the Gate, fundraising was hugely important because we had so few seats. At the Rose, we have a large auditorium, so we're much more reliant on box office, but that also means that we might have to be a bit risk averse sometimes because we need stuff that will sell. And the better we are at fundraising, the more risks we can take. So I think, fundraising is about building relationships with individuals, with people who love your theatre and want to be part of your theatre. And a lot of those people are really smart, interesting people who are really, really engaged. So I think it's we tend to be quite English and go, I couldn't possibly ask for money. But, it's an essential part of the job. Somebody said, what's the hardest decision you had to make in your career? And now that it's passed, are you happy with the choice you made? That's a brilliant question. What is the hardest decision? I'm not sure. I think the decisions that I've made that have been most defining are the decisions I've made about knowing when I'm not good enough to do something. So I acted all the way through my time at school, all the way. I was an actor at university. I was acting in like 18 shows or something at university. And I went to drama school to train as an actor. And then it was the sort of realization while I was at drama school that it didn't feel quite right. That I sort of, and that took time, because I'd spent so many years doing it. And then I remember one of our teachers in the second year, made a passing comment about, if you want to be an actor, and he just said, and you've really got to want to do nothing else. And I remember thinking to myself, well, there are other things I want to do. And actually, that realization that it wasn't the thing I was best at, and kind of confronting that and going, okay, I've got to make a decision whether or not I continue pursuing this, because it's going to be emotionally draining and, time consuming, was a really, really essential decision to make. And so that was a hard decision. I'm trying to think of other hard decisions. Another hard decision I had to make, actually, is I had commissioned a writer who I think is really brilliant, and I have continued to work with since. And the piece they wrote, we went through several drafts, and I just didn't think it was ever going to get to where it needed to be. And so I had to find a way of telling that writer that I wasn't going to produce it. And that was really hard. And I remember speaking to the literary manager at the Royal Court at the time, Chris, also called Chris, and asking his advice on how do you do that. And in the end, I sat down with this writer in a cafe and I said, look, I totally see what you're trying to do, but this isn't going, I don't think this is going to work in the way that I imagine it needs to. And the writer was obviously very disappointed and quite upset, but we talked it through. And, that was hard, but it was the right decision. And I've commissioned them since and produced them since. So, it didn't damage the relationship, but that was certainly a tough call. Let me see. Now, I'm going to try and work out how to look at questions on Instagram as well. How can an artistic director help the theatre reflect its local community? I think that's a brilliant question. I think it's really important. I think a theatre, particularly a theatre like the Rose, which is really embedded in its community in Kingston, has to reflect that community. I think there are different ways of doing it. I think you need to... Okay, so for us at the Rose, we have a massive youth theatre run by a brilliant woman, Lucy Morell. There are 1,200 young people and adults that come through that youth theatre that come through that community outreach department every year. Some of them just do classes, some of them end up performing in the shows. And when I went for my interview, I made it very clear that I wanted that youth theatre and those participants to feel even more embedded in our work. So what I'm hoping to do is, as we produce work, that we will produce shows where we are finding ways for those youth theatre members and for professional actors to be on stage together, so that the youth theatre are an absolutely essential part of our core programming. I think when Sean Holmes ran the Lyric in Hammersmith, he did a really good job of that. I think how else to engage the youth, how else to engage the community. Well, there's a really good example, actually, the Royal Exchange in Manchester, and this is an idea that I want to steal off them quite shamelessly. If you go to the box office at the Exchange, there are, like, you know, where they have all the leaflets that explain what other shows are on. They have, I saw one leaflet, their red leaflet that said audience manifesto. And I picked it up, and it was a manifesto that they of things that that they had solicited from their audience, statements about what they wanted the exchange to be. And I found that really, really inspiring, because it was a way of not only getting to know your audience more, but then a way of showing them through that, you know, piece of print in the foyer that their opinion, that their perspective on the theatre is absolutely essential. So I think one has to constantly be thinking of creative ways to give your audience a voice, but then also thinking of how to reach members of the community that don't currently come to the theatre. And that's a much more complicated issue, because if people aren't coming, you've got to ask, well, why aren't they coming? Do they have to come? You know, if they don't want to come, why should we try and force, we can't force them. But then you need to be looking at the barriers to that engagement. And I actually wrote an article. I did a CLAW fellowship a few years ago with the CLAW Leadership Foundation. If you go onto CLAW, CLORE, if you go onto their website, if you Google Christopher Haydon and where are the workers, I wrote a sort of piece of research about class diversity in British theatre audiences, and how audiences could make their how theatres could make their audiences much more diverse, from specifically looking at it through the perspective of class. So I think that's quite a useful, way of, and I spoke to lots of theatres about the different ways they have found to engage audiences, and looking at everything from the foyer to the, in the front of house experience to ticket prices. I was really struck that often ticket prices are not the primary barrier to people engaging. Which I found really interesting. There are plenty of other sort of more invisible barriers that stop people feeling like they can take ownership of a space. So yeah, if you search my name and where are the workers, you should be able to find that piece of research. What else do we have here? If budget wasn't an issue, what kind of a show would you like to put on? Oh, that's brilliant. Okay, there are two answers to that. Firstly, I think the phrase necessity is the mother of invention is a really, really useful one. Often the best work that you can make comes out of the constraints rather than through a lack of them. So for instance, the show I did at the Gate a few years ago called Grounded, which was a monologue performed by the brilliant Lucy Ellenson about a drone pilot, and was hugely successful for us. That show came about because I was programming my first year. I looked at my budget and I was like, we don't have enough money we have to do 5 shows a year. We don't really have enough money to do a 5th show. We've only got enough money if it's a monologue. So I emailed my friend Liz, who was the literary manager at the Public Theatre in New York, another really good example of a theatre that combines its relationship with its community and its artists brilliantly. And I said to her, look, I need a monologue. If it's political, all the better. What have you got? And she sent me this thing, and she said, look, this is a monologue about a drone pilot. It's not been performed yet, but I'm really excited by it. And I remember downloading the document and thinking, please, God, let this be good, because it solves all of my problems if it is. And it was absolutely amazing, and we did it. So in a way, the constraint was the thing that led to that project. But if budget was no limit, I'm really excited by the work of Punch Drunk. I find their immersive stuff thrilling, partly because I think I have no idea how I would make it. So I guess if budget was no limit, I would love to make a massive immersive show, and part of the production budget for that show would be me learning how to do it. So it might take 3 or 4 years of me paying myself to go and see a load of immersive work and talk to a load of people and sit in on other people's rehearsal rooms. But if budget was no limit, then I think that's probably the thing I would do. Or I'd make a huge movie. What other questions are there? Nothing there. Let's look down Facebook. Do you think it's important for theatres to have a speciality, as it were, and does that in turn lead to greater practical training opportunities for emerging artists? It depends what you mean by speciality. I mean, I think this sort of goes back to what I was saying about theatres having specific identities. So, the Many a Chocolate Factory doesn't only do musicals, but it clearly does a great many musicals and does them hugely successfully. I think a theatre has to have a sense of why it exists and what its purpose is. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that if you know why you exist, in terms of why you exist from your artist's point of view and why you exist from your audience's point of view, then that will percolate through all of your programming. And then it will also help you with artist development, because you'll know what kind of artists you're looking to develop, and you will naturally draw those artists to you. You know, if people are passionate about Shakespeare, they're naturally going to be drawn to the Globe or the RSC or whatever. If people are, you know, really passionate, if people have a kind of taste for those sort of like epic kind of surprising on-stage events, you know, you're going to be drawn to Rupert Gould's work. You know, if people have a taste for sort of, you know, the kind of European aesthetic, then people are going to be drawn to what David was doing at the Young Vic. And I think the two have to go hand in hand. I certainly know that in my time at the Gate and hopefully at the Rose, I've developed amazing relationships with young artists, but they've always come through a shared sensibility. And sometimes I might meet a young artist who I think is talented, but doesn't quite connect with me personally. And then I can find the right venue for them to be attached to, or the right person for them to speak to. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so Adam asks, I agree about the monothematic theatres. It's so much more interesting to look for values and ideas rippling beneath an eclectic programme of work. And as a recent convert to the dark arts of fundraising, I now can't imagine doing my job in the future without being front and centre in it. How wide will the range of genre be at your new Rose? I think that's a really good question. I think we want to be very wide. I think the thing that I'm going to find hardest to do at the Rose, at least in the short term, is new writing, which is interesting for me because my background has largely been in new writing. And the reason for that is, if you're doing a play by a writer that no one's heard of, or with a title that's not, you know, even if the writer's famous, a title that no one's heard of, it's very, very hard to attract the large numbers of people that we need to go and see that show, unless you can cast somebody super famous in it. So, you know, if Benedict Cumberbatch wants to do any play, we can do it. That's fine. He'll sell tickets. So there are certain things I can't do at the Rose at the moment. Although as I get to know the audience better, as I get to know the building better, hopefully I'll be able to find ways of being able to put more new writing on our stage, because that again goes back to sort of managing the budget around things and how you fund things. Because if you can do a show without taking much of a financial risk, you know, your job is to minimize financial risk and maximize artistic risk. So if you can find a way of doing that with new writing, through casting, for instance, that's one thing. But otherwise, I want the Rose to be as broad as possible. I'm really interested in reviving great British plays, reviving great European plays. I'm really interested in finding a really eclectic range of directors to come in and you know, some people that really excite me to kind of do things with those plays. I'm also really, really drawn to musical theatre, which is not something that I have much experience of making, although I am developing a new musical at the moment. But I think staging musicals, I think the Rose has a great space for musicals. It's kind of an epic wide stage. So that is something that I want to do as well. And again, the trick will be, when you look at the brochure, or our e-brochure, we don't do print anymore, that you look at the range of different shows and go, gosh, there are so many different things here, and yet somehow it all makes sense. So yeah, hopefully it'll be a wide range. What are the common mistakes, pitfalls that you see from directors and artistic directors, and what do you think are the best ways to avoid or overcome them? Gosh, that's a big question. I think my instinctive answer to that is, I did a workshop years and years ago with Katie Mitchell when I was just starting out, and she made a comment where she said, you need to know the difference between the work you enjoy seeing and the work you're good at making. And she talked about a certain kind of work she'd seen in Poland that she found really thrilling, but she knew that she just wasn't capable of making it. And I think understanding the distinction between those two things is really vital. I know directors who are really talented at directing, say, new writing and text-based work, but who really love watching devised work. And they've tried to make devised work, and it just hasn't quite come together because it's not in their skill set. So actually being really clear with yourself about going, I love watching that, but I couldn't make it. Maybe that's my point about immersive theatre. I don't think I ever could make a show like that. So I enjoy watching it, but I'm probably never going to actually make something like that. So I think that's a common mistake. And then a common mistake with artistic directors, I think I think our theatres in this country are generally really well run, artistically, people working, against really tight financial barriers, against all sorts of things. And, there have been problems in the past. Obviously, a few years ago in particular, there was an incredible lack of diversity amongst the leadership in the sector and amongst the work being made. But obviously, we've seen real changes and strides made in that area in the last few years. And that's a really exciting thing. But I think, again, I guess it's easy as an artistic director to become complacent. If you feel like you know what the audience wants, you're going to stop stretching yourself and you're going to stop stretching your audience. And then that can kind of lead to you taking fewer risks than you should do, because risk is inherent to creativity. It's 1:30 now. I think we probably have to finish. I hope I've answered all the questions. Is there anything else? Yes, I don't think I missed any question. All right, I hope that was helpful. I hope the internet worked. It's very weird talking to essentially a video of myself. But anyway, I hope that was helpful. And thank you for tuning in, and tune into all the other amazing King's Head Skills sessions. It's a brilliant theatre run by brilliant people. So yeah, thank you. Okay, bye.